Welcome back to the Sky News Daily. I'm Niall Paterson. And look, no prizes for guessing where we begin the week. Fresh outbreaks of violence took place around the country at the weekend. A hotel in Rotherham, housing asylum seekers, was stormed and set alight. A citizens' advice centre in Sunderland and a children's library in Liverpool also destroyed. Mosques have been attacked, shops looted. The reasons why, well, those are a little harder to come by than evidence of any barbarity. Ostensibly, these gatherings were a response to the killing of 3 children in Southport a week ago. Yet the savagery and the violence that followed the protests led the Prime Minister to call it as he sees it.
This is not protest. It is organised, violent thuggery. And it has no place on our streets or online. So no, I won't shy away from calling it what it is. Far-right thuggery.
So we've had another meeting of the government's Emergency Cobra Committee to thrash out the response as Sir Keir Starmer faces perhaps his first test as Prime Minister. Sky's political correspondent Rob Powell is back on the podcast. So Rob, look, what exactly are the government doing about this?
Yeah, it's a difficult one for government, isn't it? Because you're completely right. We do turn to them and say, what are you going to do to stop this violence? Actually, it's the police that take the lead in this, but clearly it's government that will get the blame and where the questions arrive if this gets worse and escalates. In terms of the sort of practical steps, though, that the government have, really the approach that's been set out by Sir Keir Starmer is quite in the vein of what happened in 2011 around the London riots. So first of all, it is cast iron backing for the police, giving the police essentially the kind of political cover to do what they feel needs to be done. There's the question of resources as well. And we've heard Sir Keir Starmer today after that Cobra meeting talking about a standing army of specialist officers where we need them. So it's essentially using an existing scheme that runs between police forces where they can shift around, say, riot police where they are needed. The second thing is about what happens in the criminal justice system. And I think this is where Sir Keir Starmer's kind of reaching back to his experience in 2011 when he was Director of Public Prosecutions and we had things like 24-hour courts and rapid charges of people involved in riots back then, heavier sentences being handed out. All of that stuff is being looked at. We've had 70 extra prosecutors working across the weekend. We've had a very proactive attempt to name people as they are being charged and going to court and update the media and the public on the number of arrests. So all of this is, yes, to practically deal with a lot of people, but it's also about deterrence. It's about saying to people that might be thinking of going out and joining this disorder that you're not going to get tangled up in a kind of bureaucratic red tape web of nothingness in the judicial system, that we will make space to make sure that you end up in a prison cell and you end up with a sentence and your life will change very, very quickly.
I wonder if you, like me, Rob, have been somewhat struck by the language used by the Prime Minister and indeed the Home Secretary. Very, very quick to identify this as far-right thuggery, not particularly minded, by my reckoning at least, to engage with those who say that whilst the violence is absolutely to be decried and not to be repeated, but who also go on to say, look, there is a reason that people are behaving in this manner. And it doesn't strike me that Sir Keir Starmer is particularly minded to engage with that concept.
This is really tricky for the government and the Prime Minister, I think. I was in the statement that the Prime Minister did yesterday. I was there to ask a few questions. And my second one was, does this give you any pause for thought about divisions in society or sort of how you approach other broader domestic policy issues? And you're right, he didn't bite on that at all. Look, I think there's a reason for that. We spoke yesterday to the government's advisor on political violence, Lord Wolney, and he said what you need to do in situations like this is talk about the sort of logistics of tackling the criminal elements of this, the violence, and essentially not allow yourself to be dragged into a broader political debate. Because he said what that gives off essentially is that you are allowing violence and criminality to shape credible, legitimate debate. I think that is why the Prime Minister is not prepared to engage in any of the sort of political motivations that are washing around under the surface. You can see the sort of long-term principled approach of saying we don't negotiate with terrorists, we don't let people who are committing violence and burning down hotels affect what we talk about in civilised society and what credible political debate is shaped or pushed in which direction. But the difficulty is that for the people that are stoking a lot of this unrest, it feeds the kind of motivation that they already have, that they're not being listened to, that they're being ignored, that the reasons, that their concerns are being brushed under the carpet and they're just being tarred as far-right thugs. So, you can see why he's doing it, but it doesn't come without risk.
It doesn't come without risk, and I would argue one of the big risks is that sitting in Parliament at the moment are people who are making this very point, that there is a constituency that for however long has been ignored, that their complaints, if raised, were called racist. Look, we've just had a general election in which the Reform Party stood very much on the anti-immigration point. They've only ended up with 5 seats, but millions of people voted for them. Even if you disagree that the riots are taking place because of immigration, enough people are saying it so that surely Sir Keir Starmer has to engage with it at some point, and I would argue sooner rather than later.
I think that this is an issue of political messaging, and you're right that sooner rather than later, I think Sir Keir Starmer will need to try and address some of the sort of bubbling concerns that are washing around under the surface. I think the feeling in government, though, is that whilst hotels are being burnt and whilst police officers are being hospitalised, it is not the time to be debating the political motivation, because the political motivation, in their view, is irrelevant to doing that.
Let's pause just for a second. We will be back with more from Rob a little later. But after the break, an anti-hate campaigner who was himself once one of Tommy Robinson's English Defence League. Back soon. Welcome back. The violence that seems to have gone hand in hand with the so-called protests is impossible to ignore. So too, though, the chorus of complaint from those who take issue with immigration policy and are described as far-right as a result. Ivan Humble is an anti-hate campaigner and an activist in countering radicalisation. What makes his experience special is that for many years he was a prominent leader in Tommy Robinson's English Defence League. Before that is, a Muslim man took time to sit down and discuss his views with him.
Obviously something's gone wrong over the years to come to this point. What I'm seeing is lots of behaviour that I can't even excuse, I can't make an excuse for. But if you look through or you look past the manifestations and the consequences at the minute, there is an underlying anger and frustration mindset with various issues, controversial issues within the communities, that we're just not brave enough, I guess, to have those difficult conversations with. And the downside to that is, where we're not having these conversations in the public sphere, sadly, controversial voices, the far right, people looking to cause division, are having them conversations, which enables them to own it and manipulate the genuine concerns of ordinary folk into whatever narrative they want. Everything's been picked aside, everything's divisional. There's no voices bringing people together. I think that's the bigger issue.
But it's been a big problem for an awfully long time, hasn't it? So what has changed?
I think people have just had enough at the minute of not being heard, not being listened to. Like, if you look at it with bigger picture without the narratives and stuff, you can't blame them for not wanting to be heard, because when the politicians are making up decisions that affect the whole country, to do it fairly, which is what everybody wants to be, is be treated fairly and equal, you have to listen to every voice in the community, whether you agree with that or not, because how else are we going to find a way forward or a solution to make things better and easier?
Let's talk about your own experience then, Ivan, just briefly. English Defence League certainly doesn't exist in the form it did when you were active within its ranks, but its name still gets thrown around at these protests. It certainly still resonates for an awful lot of people. How did you end up with the EDL?
Mine was triggered, like most people, back in 2009 by the Troops Homecoming Parade in Luton, and where a group of Muslims protested against our troops coming back. It was that sort of got my attention. So I went to my local town hall and spoke to a councillor. I'm not going to slate them, because they did listen to me, they did have a conversation with me. But that's all that was a conversation. I left there feeling a bit more frustrated. We go to the online space to air my anger, where I entered into another conversation with a man on there. And after a couple of hours of chatting, he offered me a solution, and he said the EDL was being formed or being launched in a couple of weeks, and the sole purpose is to stand up against the radical Muslims. Back then, because of that option, I took that option. Looking back with hindsight, because that's a good thing after you've made loads of mistakes, you can look back. I do believe, or I'm not saying it would change my journey 100%, but if the counsellor that I spoke to that day gave me an option, like, if I understand what you're saying, Evan, but I don't agree with you, but you could email this person or somebody in this department in the government, a lot of my anger and frustration might have gone into an email, and then I wouldn't have felt the need to speak out about it. But that didn't happen, and I ended up joining the EDL for 5 years. What Tommy is, he's a symptom of deeper societal problems that we don't talk about, and that's where I got mixed up, because I formed an opinion that nobody else was talking about.
So you were an active member of the EDL for 5 years, but you eventually left, and that change of mind, I suppose you could call it, was brought about by a conversation with one very specific individual, wasn't it?
The reason I say about dialogue is so powerful is because my change of life come from my enemy, the Muslim I hated the most, the one with the brown skin and the big beard. He took a chance and spoke to me, and in the 5 years I was mixed up in that life, no white person said to me, I don't want to hear what you've got to say. They pointed their fingers and labelled me. But the person I hated the most sat me down and gave me that chance to have my voice heard. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't easy, because I was trying to provoke him, I was trying to make him angry. But this Muslim guy just sat there respectfully. Once I'd run out of breath, he was then able to speak. He explained a bit about common ground, where some of the issues I was talking about or mentioned to him, as a Muslim, he shared the same sort of genuine concerns. So then that little introduction of a bit of common ground made me think a little bit. So because he showed me that respect that day, I said to him, look, I'm old school, so you've treated me with respect. It's only fair that I treat you with respect. And I asked him if he would be prepared to sit down with me more often and explain some of my misconceptions and help me understand some of the things I was saying, which, lucky for me, he did do. And that led to 2.5 years of conversation about various issues, him explaining, not just that, taking me out into his community, meeting people, going to a mosque. I was an EDL member throughout this until I left. So after 2.5 years of conversation and meeting people and talking to people, I become more educated on some of the things I was saying. So I felt it was my time to walk away from hatred, because for the first time in my life, I had Muslim friends. Before that, I never had that. So saying some of the things and doing some things I was doing was easy, because it didn't affect nobody I knew. But once I started becoming friends with Muslims, things become harder.
So how do we then facilitate conversations like that on the scale which is going to clearly be required, given we're seeing riots, protests up and down the country? And how do we do that without the involvement of the politicians who, I'm sure you will agree, have helped to stoke this through culture war issues, through issues of division, through the general tone that they bring to politics?
Yeah, and the language used and everything, yeah. I haven't got the answer to that, Poppy, because it just sounds so easy that dialogue is the answer, but how to put that into action and to make it work is going to take somebody with a bit of a better brain than me. And until you talk to the other person, you can't challenge them. So you need to listen to what they're going to say to be able to challenge people.
In the absence, though, of that discussion, a week, 2 weeks, a month from now, where do you see us being?
I don't think we'll be any better off. I think the violence will die down for a little bit, but it will come back, because we spend too much time in the public sphere talking about the manifestations of stuff, and not enough time about understanding the root causes and how the general public are feeling. There's not a political party or politician out there that I think resonates with everybody.
final thought then from our political correspondent, Rob Powell. And Rob, look, I see that there is potentially a real issue for our political class right now. I mean, we have had election after election in which both sides have promised to bring the numbers down. And this goes back to the last time that Labour were in power themselves. People keep voting for things to change, and yet the politicians do little to nothing.
Yeah, you're right. Politicians have promised for the number to come down. And instead, we essentially have large parts of the country, large sectors of the country, whether it's social care, whether it's the NHS, whether it's the way that we run and fund our universities, that are wholly dependent on high levels of migration. The danger is that you can have that debate, and that is a perfectly credible and reasonable debate to have. But, you don't need to start setting fire to hotels and turning up outside asylum seeker hotels and daubing racist graffiti on hotels to try and have that debate. So I think that's why we are in a very, very difficult position here. And I'm, almost hesitant to get too stuck into that debate, because you can't let credible debate be shaped and led by people that are committing criminal acts and being violent. But you're completely right that these are not scenes from a cohesive and happy country. One part of it is migration, but I think even the more worrying part of it is not necessarily the people that are going out and expressing concerns about migration in completely outrageous and inappropriate ways. It is the people that are joining in almost for the hell of it. Because, if you feel that emboldened enough to walk into a branch of Shoe Zone or Lush or Greggs and steal things without even covering your face, then what does that say about your kind of relationship with civil society? So yes, there's the sort of domestic policy issue around people's concerns about being ignored about immigration, but there's also just, I think, a kind of much more broader and pernicious question to be asked about whether people feel part of society, whether people feel that society works for them. And I'd argue that when you have people that seem to be joining in mindless violence like that for no specific ideological reason other than the fact that they can, then that tells you something about society as well. And I think arguably that is even more difficult to address than questions around migration.
I suspect, though, that the longer that this goes on, the more that people will focus on the politicians and their role in either not recognising this as an issue or allowing this to develop into an issue. We've had Dame Sarah Khan, Rishi Sunak's independent advisor for social cohesion until May. I mean, she's come out and suggested the Conservatives created the space for these far-right protests to grow. And frankly, and you can understand why Labour figures on the front bench have leapt on that. But, I remember the Labour Party, when last in government, steadfastly refusing to talk about immigration, to run away from any discussion about immigration at any point because they feared they'd be called racist.
This thing about we don't talk about it enough, certainly since I've been a journalist, which has been sort of 12, 13 years and 8 years in Westminster, that sometimes we talk about little else than migration. So the idea that we can't have that debate now, I think is a bit of a straw man. And I think when you have something happening, and this is not an argument about the pros and cons of migration at all, it's an argument about democracy, and it's an argument about if you want to do something and allow something to happen in a country, then you damn well better put it in a manifesto and get people to vote for it. And I think it's going to be a defining feature of the rest of the first term of a Labour government of how they address it, because clearly, unlike the Conservatives, who are able to sort of bang the drum, and we can have an argument about whether that drum banging that has come from the Conservatives over the last few years contributed to the kind of tone and the context or stoked what has gone on in the last few days, it is much more difficult for Labour to do because of the coalition of supporters that they are trying to hold together. Already, we see some within the Labour movement that feel that Sir Keir Starmer didn't go far enough in what he said yesterday. So it's going to be a really, really difficult one for Sir Keir Starmer to square politically.
Perhaps the one thing we can say with certainty, Rob, is that Keir Starmer's honeymoon period is completely over. You've got riots, streets up and down the country. You've got the global financial markets, having a bit of a tizzy right now. And, we've probably got a major outbreak of violence across the Middle East to look forward to too. I mean, who'd be a Prime Minister, eh?
Look, this is the fundamental difference between opposition and government that Sir Keir Starmer is finding out. Back on Monday after that absolutely horrific turn of events in Southport, Sir Keir Starmer probably thought that his political role this week was to sort of try and kind of capture the sense of shock and horror and grief across the country and try and sort of feed that back as a nation's leader. 5 days on, he is finding himself talking about 24-hour courts and bussing riot police around the country. It has morphed and turned into what is definitely the biggest test he's had since he entered office. But look, that's being in government, right? It's these things that come along seemingly unannounced or unnoticed, and it's how you respond to them that can define, how you are viewed as a leader and a prime minister.
No doubt this will not be the last time the podcast addresses the civil disobedience and violence on Britain's streets, because, no doubt, for now at least, it will continue. If these protests are truly about the senseless killing of 3 young children, then perhaps the protesters should act like they remember that. Sir Keir Starmer has called it far-right thuggery with, frankly, plenty of evidence and justification. But he's also aware that year after year, concerns about immigration policy have been expressed at the ballot box. And time and again, they've been ignored by politicians who look a lot like him. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again tomorrow.